Hi, everyone. This is Peter, and I want to just do a quick introduction to an important theme in the story of the visual arts in Western Europe. I guess is the best way to describe this. It's important to understand that Europe as an entity doesn't really emerge, probably, if we think about the time after the fall of Rome, end of the 5th century. Popular date is 476. The story of Western Europe emerging is a pretty long, complicated one. Some people would argue it's probably not happening until well into the 15th century. Other people would argue that especially the efforts of Charlemagne, again, his famous being crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 CE is a good kind of marker for that recognition of the new importance of Western Europe, that Charlemagne as protector of the Catholic Church certainly marks a change in priorities, that Rome needs protection from the West as opposed to the other way around, I'll say in the 1st or 2nd century CE. The story is complicated in lots and lots of ways. The story of early medieval, and we'll use the word medieval in a kind of relying on old category sense, the period where the Roman Empire is no longer operating as a kind of coherent or effective political, military, social entity any longer. Between again, say 500 and I think probably somewhere around the beginning of the 15th century for a lot of people is when the idea of early modernity, I guess, is often used by historians. So this piece will mostly focus on this period from about 500 to maybe 800, somewhere in there. And we're going to just look at a few examples of some very important developments, trends, and what have you that are beginning to emerge. In essence, one of the most important from the visual arts perspective is the lack of reliance on classical models for making things, basically making works of art. Indeed, the category of work of art has to really be adjusted and modified to fit new circumstances. So the traditional categories that we might have looked at in, just to take the classic example of classical Greece, where we talk about sculpture and we talk about architecture, those aren't so easily used when judging the visual art productions of a very nomadic and, we'll say, pre-literate culture. We don't really have good examples of architecture. Buildings were often made of wood. Monumental stone architecture is really a thing that emerges in the time of Charlemagne. We don't have monumental sculpture. These people were often on the go and didn't have we'll say, need, desire, whatever, to put up large figural sculptures. So to find the kinds of examples of art, typical art from the cultures, we often refer to Hiberno-Saxon culture, typical of these people, we'd have to scale down considerably. So, for instance, the example that I'm looking at right now, which is a belt buckle from Sutton Hoo, is, I think, roughly 5 inches in length. And personal kind of accoutrements or artifacts are a great place to start. The famous ship burial at Sutton Hoo in England is a real important source for objects, particularly if they're made, as they often were, from precious metals or gems and found themselves being recycled for other purposes. A ship burial is a great opportunity for anthropologists and art historians alike to look at, what these cultures felt was important. So, the critical thing to take away from these objects, again, they're relatively small, very portable, made from precious materials, gold and gems, in particular, very, very high degree of workmanship. Technical virtuosity, extraordinary complexity, real high degree of technical finish, indicating that these were, intended for very, very important people. To give an example of what I mean in terms of in terms of technical finish. If we looked, for instance, just a little bit in detail, see if we can do that here. And we can see these beads that are around this sort of golden sphere. That is a process called granulation. It's very hard to do. Gold has a low melting point. To attach small gold beads in this fashion is indicative of high degree of workmanship and technical artistry with gold. This is right through here is a process known as niello, basically kind of mingling of enamel background and gold right here. And again, remember that the overall size of this is, I think it's roughly 5 inches in length. Looking also just more broadly at the motifs that we find in the in this very famous Sutton belt buckle, there's this extraordinary array of what's often described by art historians as interlace. Interlace describes this looped and connected series of linear ornamental motifs. Often it's sort of subtle and hard to find sometimes, but often terminating in somewhat animal-like shapes. It can often be in the shape of birds or snakes or things like that. And in other words, there's a high degree of abstraction. So, for instance, in the upper corner here, you might see what looks like a bird beak and an eye. There's a certain degree of alluding to or echoing shapes you might find in nature. It's not necessarily entirely unrepresentational, like, for instance, this area right here in the middle. But abstraction and geometric ornament certainly play an extensive role in the overall appearance. You can see more examples of this interlace. And as I said, often with serpents, there might be two serpents biting on each other, or birds and snakes fighting. You can see what looks perhaps like that's going on here. So the overall sense with an object like this is a very new mode of art making that doesn't rely on representation, doesn't rely on narrative, doesn't rely on the traditional categories of art. These would have been objects of everyday use, possibly of exchange, cultures that would rely on gifts, a way, for instance, of showing the prestige of a tribal chieftain or something like that. And so we really have to readjust our expectations as we look at art from this time. Over time, as we come out of the basically out of the 5th into the 6th centuries, a pretty important development in terms of the culture of Western Europe is taking place, and that is the adoption of Christianity. And Christianity brings with it a bunch of associated cultural phenomena. One of them is going to be increasing contact with culture to the south and to the east, in particular, obviously, that of the Italian peninsula. Classical sources, in other words, have a possibly much higher, much more important role to play. This is certainly brought to a head in the scriptoria and architectural, etc., productions of Charlemagne. So the arrival of Christianity is certainly important in that regard. It's also very much a religion of the book. And so that's important because when you have a pre-literate culture that is making a sort of transition, if you will, away from its pre-literate status to literate status, books are going to be, and they already would be, printing hasn't been invented, that won't happen for quite some time, objects of a great deal of value and even mystery and wonderment. And they're also understood, and I think quite rightly, as repositories of knowledge. And Christianity is very much, like most religions that rely on books, very interested in preserving knowledge into the future. I won't say relatively recent, but maybe relatively recent Roman invention of what's known as the Codex, Codex, basically the bound book, saw ready adoption all over Western Europe, and in particular, for our purposes, most interestingly, among the monasteries that we find popping up along the west coast of what today would be regarded more or less as the British Isles, so particularly in places like Scotland and Ireland. Monasteries are set up to, in essence, try to escape the constant attacks by marauding nomadic warriors. Later, they'll sort of all be lumped in somewhat inaccurately as the Vikings in particular. So the monks would set themselves up very far away from Western Europe. And there's not much to do being a monk in a place like this. One of the ways of showing devotion and preserving the Christian record is to copy manuscripts, in particular Gospels, commentaries on Gospels. There's a wide range of possible productions that you could do if you were making a book. We're going to focus a little bit on Gospels. They were a popular subject, having to do, of course, with the life and ideas of Christ, and are relatively short compared to, say, the books of the Hebrew Bible. Again, we owe a great deal to these productions. They're painstakingly created, written on parchment. Paper isn't a thing for many years. They are very, very carefully produced with intricate, much like the example of the buckle from Sutton Hoo, intricately interlaced ornament, very two-dimensional in its emphasis, so aspects of space and depth and light and all those kinds of illusionistic or realistic, naturalistic aspects of classical art are for the most part missing. So in this example from the Book of Durrow, the Gospel of Matthew, symbolized by this man here, the man is very two-dimensional in nature, certainly not a typical Greco-Roman idea of a human being. Carpet pages were an aspect of these productions. Just an example here of a most spectacular abstract cross, right, that is almost completely, let me just zoom in just a little bit, dominated by these incredibly intricate interlace ornaments. We simply wouldn't even have and remotely enough time to begin to trace the sheer variety and intricacy, and of course the technical craftsmanship required to make this kind of awe-inspiring on a small scale. Remember, it's just a book of approximately a foot in height. We would take us hours to trace all of this type of ornament. One of the most spectacular examples, which we'll close out with, is from the Book of Kells. So we looked at the Book of Durrow very briefly, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Book of Kells in the famous Chi-Rho iota page. This is the three Greek letters that begin, I think it's the Gospel of Matthew, the generations of Christ. And so these letters, not a cross as in the previous illustration, but these letters are embedded within this extraordinary matrix of, let's go in just a little bit closer, of spiral ornaments, intricate interlace, and some fascinating things. If we look really closely, for instance, we see two mice tugging over a communion wafer while a cat looks on. You can see that the row here terminates in the head of what appears to be an angel. And it's just this extraordinary outpouring of complex intertwined ornament. This is very typical. There's another angel right here, very typical of this type of production. It remains quite popular for quite a number of years and a really profound influence on Western European art, even as we'll see, the time of Charlemagne shows an increasing willingness to adopt more Greco-Roman norms, if you will.